Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'll turn on the video just to say hello. As you can see, I'm sitting in an office slash toy room with a Millennium Falcon up there. Just wanted to say hi, and I'll turn the camera off and share my screen instead, if that's okay. Yes, my name is Patrik Bihammar. I have been with Microsoft for 10 years now, but this is my first opportunity to actually keynote SQL Saturday. And I wanted to start by sharing a little bit of an anecdote. The first time I heard about SQL Saturday was actually 10 years ago. I started with Microsoft in the UK, and I was more on the infrastructure side. But my peer who was looking after SQL Server, Anthony Saxby, he's a 20+ year SQL veteran. As you do on a Friday afternoon, I asked him, hey, do you have any plans for the weekend? And he got super excited and he said, yeah, it's SQL Saturday tomorrow. I'm going into Reading and we're getting together to talk about all the latest, greatest features in SQL 2010. And I thought, gosh, these data guys, they're really committed if they work 6-day weeks, you know. But who would have thought 10 years later I would be here getting the opportunity to keynote and be part of a SQL Saturday. So really, really honored to be here. So for the past 4 years, I have been the Azure Business Group Lead in Singapore. And one observation that I think Microsoft is quite guilty of is we tend to talk a lot about SQL Server and a lot about Power BI, and more recently, a lot about Synapse. And for very good reasons. These are all fantastic technologies and they're super exciting. But I'm actually going to hijack this keynote today to talk more about the open source side of our database portfolio. And I hope I'll still be welcome back again, even though I'm hijacking a SQL Saturday to talk about open source. But I do have a little bit of a hidden agenda. Today, officially actually, is my last day as BG lead, and I'm going into a new role around business development for open source databases. So you can kind of see that this is now an even bigger charter for me, but I can honestly say, even if I was still BG lead, which I officially am today, I think this is an area that we don't talk nearly enough about. So I think it's worth spending the next 25 minutes or so looking at what we have to offer in this space. But just so I want to make sure you don't get worried that you're not going to get to hear about your favorite Microsoft technologies. There's going to be lots and lots of opportunity to go deep technically about SQL Server, of course, about Power BI, about Synapse Analytics, and about machine learning and all the other great things available in Microsoft's traditional product stack. And only yesterday, in fact, we did a SQL 2019 session for 500 people. I don't know if you were part of that or not, but if you weren't, you can always catch the on-demand session. Rohan Kumar is speaking together with Satya Nadella on December 3rd. And I've never seen a speech by Rohan where he doesn't talk about Synapse. So I'm sure you're going to get to hear about Synapse on that one as well. So don't miss that one on December 3rd, which I think is Tuesday or Wednesday next week. So with that, let me take the next 20 minutes to talk about open source. Why do we care so much about open source? Well, the reality is our customers and the market cares a lot about open source. It's virtually impossible to find a company that is not using open source in some shape or form today. And actually, increasingly, CIOs are starting to consider open source to be a primary part of their overall IT strategy, and for really, really good reasons. First of all, it's really hard for any one company, whether it's Oracle or IBM or Microsoft, to keep up with the innovation that a huge community and a huge following can provide, which we're seeing in these open source technology stacks. You also have a huge and dedicated and committed developer network. I mean, we're very lucky to have such a strong MVP following around traditional Microsoft products, but these open source communities are huge and they are super, super deep technically on the technologies. And of course, the other benefit is you're not going to get locked into proprietary software in the same way that you do with some of these giants that I mentioned earlier. So open source is definitely on the rise and here to stay, increasingly as an enterprise grade technology. So Microsoft, let's be honest, we've had a very interesting history with open source. There was a time for sure when we were competing fiercely for server market share and desktop market share against Linux. But over the last decade, we have been actually contributing to the open source community. And then when Satya took the helm, that focus has even intensified further. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the first announcement that Satya made when he became CEO was to run Office on an iPhone. So the way that Microsoft now thinks about its ecosystem is very different from when we were thinking about an ecosystem that only was inclusive to Windows or SQL. And I mean, who would have thought a decade ago that SQL Server would ever run on any other operating system than Windows Server? And now it's available on Linux with open source technologies that you thought would never be open source, like .NET. And I understand I'm a Microsoftie, and it's one thing hearing a CEO stand on a stage and say how much we love Linux and open source, but it's probably more relevant to look at what the community and external sources are showing. So this comes as a surprise to a lot of companies. I think, first of all, still many people don't associate Microsoft with open source, perhaps for our past sins, but already today, more than half of the VM cores that are running on Azure today are Linux-based. So it's a bit of a hidden secret, I think, in the community sometimes. And if you look at the open source contributor index, Microsoft is actually the #1 contributor, both in terms of the total community and in terms of active contributors to the open source community. And I posted this very proudly on LinkedIn a week or two ago, and a fellow industry peer from IBM said, but actually, if you add IBM and Red Hat together, we're #1. And I thought, oh, that's a good point. But if you're going to play that maths, you have to also do the addition of Microsoft and GitHub, which again solidifies Microsoft's #1 position. But he's right, IBM Red Hat is then #2, Google is #3, and then you have to look a lot further down the list for other cloud providers that have a very different strategy to open source in general. And if you think about the database technology, obviously Microsoft comes from a strong heritage of building our own database technology. And now we have embraced open source for the past decade, whereas other providers who didn't have a database, it was a great shortcut to take open source databases and give them cool names and make them more into proprietary offerings on their platform, which is a very different approach from the Microsoft approach. So if we look at databases specifically, probably the most popular or most well-known open source database is MySQL. Which has a huge following, not just amongst DBAs, but perhaps even more so among developers. And in the more enterprise application type database space, Postgres has really started to become a true alternative to Oracle and DB2 for legacy database migrations. These statistics here are from Gartner, and they are saying that in another 2 years, 70% of all the new in-house developed applications are going to be developed on open source. And that's for a good reason. I mean, large enterprises are paying a huge tax to the old legacy database providers. They still have a lot of legacy DB2 that they are struggling to maintain, and they are struggling to pay the support and maintenance bills. And same thing is true for Oracle, and to some extent, perhaps also for Microsoft, even though SQL Server is at a very different price level than some of these other database technologies. And the other point is that in another couple of years, 3 out of 4 databases are going to be deployed on the cloud. So you can kind of see why it makes a lot of commercial sense, even for Microsoft, to fully embrace open source and open source databases. We don't want to be the provider for only the Windows or only the Microsoft shops. We want to be able to offer an open platform. So on that point, most of you would have heard our overall Microsoft mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And from a data perspective, we simply can't do that if we don't take this open approach where we welcome any data, be it structured or unstructured, any database or database engine, because otherwise we're only helping our customers with a portion of their data estate. So if we look at Microsoft's offerings today, we offer the most comprehensive choice, and it really is about choice, of managed databases. Of course, SQL runs better on Azure than on any other cloud. It would be surprising if it didn't. But also, all the different flavors of open source relational databases are first-party citizens on the Microsoft cloud, And unlike other cloud vendors' approach, we use 100% community editions of these databases. We make sure that we stay up to date with the latest community innovation. We never fork a database and turn it into a proprietary version on Azure and fall behind that community edition. So I think that's super, super important, that approach. And then we layer that in with the enterprise grade qualities of Azure. From security with integration to Active Directory, you can run advanced threat protection, which was recently renamed to Azure Defender, on top of all of these databases to pick up on any anomaly detection of strange access to your databases, for example. So really making these already very mature open source databases even more enterprise grade. And then on the non-relational side with Cosmos DB, we also take an open approach. Cosmos DB is really an umbrella name for all the different forms of non-relational or not just SQL databases. So we have open APIs for MongoDB to handle your document and key value databases, Cassandra for column databases, Gremlin for graph databases, and to that we then also add some of our own APIs, including a SQL API and a table API. So really a very, very broad set of database technologies so that our customers can choose the best database for their particular use case and the applications that they are looking to run. And I think that is really why Microsoft continues to be the leader in the Magic Quadrant for database management systems. I really don't believe that we would be there if we hadn't taken this open approach. And you can see Oracle is still up high on the top here. I can't fault Oracle's technology. It's a little bit like VMware. If you're a DBA, you probably love Oracle, just like if you're a server admin, you love VMware. But if you're the one paying for the licenses, you're not going to have as much of a love relationship with that vendor. It's a very expensive technology. And with open source technologies, you can do more or less the same as you can do with these proprietary systems. And you can see IBM has been suffering and falling further and further down the quadrant for some of those reasons. So just to summarize why Azure for these open source databases, I think I've touched on many of these points already, but the point that we stay true to the community versions is a super important point, because that way you can avoid the lock-in. TCO, we offer the best TCO and some really innovative ways of doing high availability at a much lower cost than when you have to spin up two instances of the same database. So there's a huge saving to be made by bringing your databases to the cloud and taking advantage of the built-in high availability there. I'm going to touch on the industry-leading scalability that we offer both for Postgres and for Cosmos DB in the next couple of slides. I already touched on the integration of security, but the other important point from an integration perspective is that even though, of course, you want to run the best database and your favorite database that you are comfortable and proficient at using, you should never think about your database as an island. That database needs to integrate with the wider data estate. You need to be able to run analytics and visualization on top of that. And you want to be able to run it on anything from Kubernetes to serverless to web services. So you also need to think about how does it integrate with a wider set of cloud native technologies available on the cloud platform where I want to bring all my data. So let's talk a little bit about the history on some of these database technologies as well, because I think it's quite interesting. If we start with the probably most famous one, MySQL, and its sister database, MariaDB. MySQL really had its boom in the 90s, really correlating with the boom of the World Wide Web and internet era. And still today, 9 out of 10 websites are powered by MySQL. And it's just a critical part of that LAMP stack to run any website or web application. And it's doing a great job at that still today. So most of the websites, web apps, e-commerce sites that you see out there are running MySQL in the backend. So why then do we have MariaDB? Well, actually, the founder of MySQL, who I'm proud to say is a fellow Swede/Scandinavian, it was a bit of a Swedish-Finnish team that developed MySQL, Mikael Videus. He got quite uncomfortable when Oracle acquired Sun, and as part of that got hold of MySQL. So he was worried that if anyone's going to own this open source database, does it have to be Larry Ellison of all people? So he decided to fork his own database and start building a MySQL compatible database that again has the full backing of the community, and that's MariaDB. And we've really seen a huge rise in interest of MariaDB, partly because of the ongoing community innovation that's happening on MariaDB, where sometimes in particular MySQL Enterprise, which is now a commercial version from Oracle, is not keeping up with that community innovation. And just a short bit of trivia, perhaps for your next pub quiz night. Actually, both MySQL and MariaDB are named after Mikael's two daughters, Mi and Maria. And he actually has developed a third database called MaxDB, which I believe was acquired by SAP at some point. But you can probably guess that, yes, it's named after his son. So one pretty neat piece of trivia is that he's developed 3 databases. He's got one database for each of his 3 children. I think that's pretty cool. So I mentioned already where MySQL is being used. Definitely anything web related. And in particular also, any online transaction that you're doing is most likely powered by a MySQL database as well, as it's very, very strong at those online transactional secure transactions. So one example here in Asia is HSBC, who's running their PayMe app, which is the equivalent of PayLah or PayNow here in Singapore, on Azure database for MySQL. And I know this is a technical session, so I've included some really interesting links here. There's a video that you can watch on Microsoft Mechanics, which goes into probably a 15-20 minutes conversation about what that architecture looks like. That's really interesting to look at if you want to. Another example is gaming. Minecraft, to do another Swedish plug, a Swedish company that got acquired by Microsoft, so you can probably tell what the drivers for migrating from AWS to Azure was in this case. But again, a really interesting story in this technical blog down here in terms of how we used our database migration service to migrate these databases from RDS over to Azure. Because that's one important point. A lot of these databases are already running either on-premise or in a hosted environment somewhere. So how to do the migration is an important part, and we have lots of really strong tools to make that migration a seamless experience. So I think I've touched enough on the different use cases. Basically, WordPress, Drupal, Magento, all run on top of the MySQL and LAMP stack. One other area I didn't touch on is education, where Moodle is another popular learning management system that also runs on top of MySQL. And I touched on gaming as well. We have a few other examples like Cloud9 and Tentline as well, who are running MySQL on Azure. So that's kind of the database for your web applications. Let's shift gear into PostgreSQL, which is a database that has been around for 22 years. It was developed by essentially a genius out of Berkeley at the University of California, and has a really strong following to this day. They continue to innovate and build enterprise-grade capability into that database, which is why it's also one of the most loved databases by developers, but more for enterprise applications than for these web transactions and web application use cases. And you can see here the reason I'm comparing Postgres, which is the fast-growing line in orange in the middle, to DB2, which is the declining line in red, and the Oracle line in blue, which is also starting to taper off, is because we see Postgres often being the go-to replacement database for legacy DB2 and Oracle environments. And I'll touch a little bit more about that in a second. So why Postgres then? Well, the big fans, and I'm one of them, say that it's the world's most advanced open source relational database. And I think they really have a point here. In terms of the extensions and the rich feature set of Postgres, it's very, very hard to beat. I mean, Postgres can be a database for almost anything. They have lots of great extensions. It's one of the few, or one of the first at least, relational databases that can also run JSON document database scenarios. It has an extension called PostGIS, which actually makes it the most advanced geospatial database in the market. And it's really an enterprise proven technology at this point. In fact, on Wednesday this week, I spoke to a large global bank, and they have already made the decision that for their core banking application in 42 markets, they are going to modernize their DB2 backend, which is costing them an arm and a leg, with Postgres Community Edition. They've already made the decision, and we're now discussing how we can help them on that journey with Azure. So I don't think you can get a better seal of approval that it's an enterprise-grade database if a global bank is going to run their core banking on Postgres. So why Postgres on Azure? Very similar reasons as I mentioned in general for open source databases. Fully managed, the integration from a security perspective and the wider Azure, not just data stack, but also the application and cloud native stack. But if there's two things I want to call out that's truly different about Postgres on Azure, it's really the scalability, how we can scale that database horizontally, and I'll touch more on that. And also the flexible deployment option, where that scalable version of the database is one of them. So if we look at the deployment options, we started out with single server, which is a fully managed PaaS implementation of Postgres that offers the highest availability, 4 nines, at the lowest cost. So you can get 4 nines at 50% of the cost of getting 99.95% at twice the cost on other deployment options and other cloud platforms. Then we have expanded those capabilities. The most recent one, and I'm not going to steal the thunder, not that I could from a technical perspective, from Naginder, who's going to speak to Flexible Server at more depth in the technical session later this afternoon. But Flexible Server, as the name suggests, provides you with more flexibility and control. It's still a PaaS database, but with more control at the user end. Then we have Hyperscale, which is that enterprise-grade scalability that I touched on earlier. That's actually through an extension called Citus, which Microsoft acquired about a year and a half back. And it's the only way that you can actually scale Postgres horizontally to make it truly a distributed database. So if you want to use Postgres on, say, Aurora, for example, you can scale vertically up to 64 terabytes. If you run Citus on Azure, you can scale horizontally up to 2 petabytes. And it's not just about the size of the database. Not everyone has got a 2 petabyte database. It's more about the performance, because you can then distribute the work across those different nodes, and you can put memory, storage, and compute separately on those nodes. So it's a very cost-effective way of scaling your database as and when you need to for performance reasons. And then, as you would expect with Azure, the hybrid cloud, we also have an implementation of Postgres running on Azure Arc. And for this bank that I mentioned before, it's a perfect out in 42 markets. Not all of those 42 markets are going to have a cloud data center, whether it's an AWS or an Azure data center. So Arc is the perfect use case for those markets that have data residency requirements, but still want to run as a seamless extension to the rest of their databases running on the cloud. And then I touched on the DB2 use case already. Probably an even more common use case is actually Oracle to Postgres migrations. Microsoft has been going after Oracle to SQL migrations for a long time, but that's a much more complex migration journey, because SQL Server and Oracle are very different in terms of the database engines and the schemas. What's fantastic about Postgres is that the schemas and the indexing and also the learning curve for an Oracle DBA to Postgres is much easier, which is why we're seeing a lot of customers who want to get out of Oracle for licensing reasons, move to Postgres, or also customers who perhaps even wanted to stay on Oracle, but they find that Oracle is making it difficult to bring their data to the cloud, to any other cloud platform than OCI. So this is increasingly a very common use case. We have quite a number of those scenarios that we have done, a lot of them in insurance in this part of the world, but definitely a very popular use case now for Postgres as an alternative to Oracle. So one such example here, this is a utilities company. They were running open text documentum on Oracle databases. When they needed to bring that and scale it out to 12 environments worldwide, they realized that they were going to have to invest in a lot of new hardware and a lot of new Oracle licenses. So instead, they decided to move it to Azure. And of course, they got a lot of cost savings, but also a lot of performance and high availability and DR benefits simply from bringing it to the cloud. Another example here is a New Zealand bank who is running hyperscale, not so much for the size of database as for the performance, where they were able to reduce the time it takes to onboard customers down from 40 minutes to 2 minutes by scaling it out horizontally. And if they would have done the same vertically, it would have cost them a lot more and wouldn't have had the same level of agility and therefore cost benefits. And Microsoft, we are using Citus ourselves. I don't know how much of a factor this was in our decision to acquire this technology, but we're actually using it for that big data use case where you have 2 petabytes of data with 6 million queries running against that data on a daily basis to decide on when to roll out Windows updates. And the query response time is less than 200 milliseconds. So I kind of touched on the use cases here. You can see there's a lot of banks and enterprise grade organizations that's already using Postgres on Azure. So let's switch gear here from relational into the no SQL or not only SQL world of Cosmos. So Cosmos DB is, we tend to call it a globally distributed database. And this is one of the ways that we're able to offer 5 nines availability for Cosmos DB workloads. But the way I think about Cosmos is it really gives you those options when a relational database is just not the right fit. You want to use document, key value stores, column stores, graph API, table APIs, then Cosmos is your go-to database. And also, if you have an application that require extremely high throughput and extremely low latency, then Cosmos DB is the right database for you. So rather than kind of pointing out which are the use cases, think about those requirements of your database: throughput, availability, and latency. And then, of course, the openness in terms of which API do I need to use for this database. And sometimes customers experiment with what's going to be the right API to get the best possible performance as well. So as I said, it's hard to point out exactly what's the use case for Cosmos. There's lots and lots of use cases. And as you can see here, it's also hard to put a finger on which are the type of customers that are using Cosmos. But a lot, of course, of global e-commerce and retail, a lot of IoT scenarios. We see a lot of the manufacturers like Rolls-Royce and Daimler and Mercedes and other using Cosmos for those high throughput and real-time scenarios. So with that, I've talked about a lot of different databases, and I think the main point I want to make is it's really about choice and figuring out, both because of your own preference, but then because of the nature of the different databases. If you think about web, think about MySQL. If you think about replacing legacy databases, think about Postgres. If you have applications that are not yet supported on an open source database, then SQL is going to be the right option for you. And if you have a non-relational use case, then Cosmos is where you want to go. And just to close out, we also help you with that migration. I already touched on the RDS to Azure migration. They did that by using the Azure Database Migration Service and the Data Migration Assistant. We also partner with a lot of great third-party tools that can do an even better job in some cases, particularly around Postgres, Oracle to Postgres migration. We use open source tools like Aura to PG, DB to PG that do a fantastic job at that schema compatibility and conversion, and also companies like Attunity and Stream that help us do migrations with 0 downtime. So there's lots of ways and tools that we can help make that migration more seamless. And with that, how are we doing for time? I do have a video that I could play to energize the crowd a bit more before we go into the breakouts, or if we're on time, we can just skip that video. How are we doing on time, Pio and crew?
You're just right on time, Patrick. So I guess we can send
Okay.
Is there a link for the video so that we can send it to the?
Yeah, it's okay. It's more of a marketing video. I like it because it's an energizer in the morning on a Saturday, but you just have to have more coffee.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very enlightening keynote. I love the trivia
Thank you.
about the database names. I didn't know that.
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully I gave you a bit of a whirlwind look into the open source world of our database technologies.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for having me. I look forward to the technical session this afternoon.
All right. Thank you, Patrik.